Okay then, feminism. What a dreadful bunch of misogynists you must be. Don't you know that feminism is just about equality of the sexes? No. I'm serious. Feminism is just about equality, so long as you understand that the word equality no longer means what it used to mean. To those well versed in the manner in which policy narratives have changed in the last dozen years, prepare yourselves for the radical revision of the meaning of the word equality, which is now politically and judicially established. My first encounter with the brave new world of equality was in the Corsten report on women in prison. Equality does not mean treating everyone the same. I was rather shocked. Hopelessly unreconstructed antediluvian that I am, I do regard equality as meaning that one treats everyone the same. I have a suspicion that the overwhelming majority of the public would do, but not our political and judicial classes. The government's guide to the 2010 Equality Act specifically cautions against treating everyone the same. The advice on the interpretation of the Act is, I quote, "The equality duty does not require public bodies to treat everyone the same. Complying with the equality duty may involve treating some people better." No, I'm not making this up. Inevitably, one wonders which people. The Equal Treatment Bench Book is the formal advice given to judges by the Judicial College on matters of how equality are to be addressed in court. I quote, True equal treatment may not always mean treating everyone in the same way. This begs an obvious question. Just how differently must you treat two people in order for true equality to be achieved? Because that question has no answer, it gives those in authority the power to do whatever they wish and call it true equality. This is the trick that has been worked upon us. Do not imagine that these are mere philosophical niceties without import in the real world. On the contrary, they have a profound impact on the lives of at least hundreds of thousands of people annually. For example, this corruption of the meaning of equality drives who is incarcerated in prison and who is not, and who has access to their own children and who has not. This distorted view of equality as preferencing is justified in the primary legislation by appeal to people with protected characteristics as being either disproportionately underrepresented in certain areas or on the basis of differences in need. Both of these provisions present opportunities which can be and are being exploited by those who, in truth, are motivated by prejudice. Appeal to disproportionate underrepresentation actually presumes that enforced equality of outcome is an indisputable good. Well, I disagree, but even if one did agree, the operation of this provision in practice is profoundly prejudicial. It is disingenuous to pretend that this provision is really about imposing equality of outcome in everything. It merely allows those in power to do so in areas which align with their prejudice. For example, the government enacts policies to encourage or to ensure an increasing proportion of women as MPs or in senior employment positions, but does nothing about sex inequalities in education as regards either teachers or student attainment. If challenged, this skew in application of the disproportion rule can be bolstered by appeal to the second provision, need. But who is to judge the needs of one group over the needs of another? Those who control the narrative, of course. At this point, the popular perception of history, together with human social psychology, have the dominant influence. And this brings me finally to the two themes of my talk: the perception of history and the innate psychological bias in the perception of needs. I'll address both of them in that order, and in both cases by giving one example. Do not doubt the significance of the perception of history. It provides an apparent moral legitimacy to the feminist outlook. I say apparent because it is false in two respects. Firstly, it's morally illiterate to attempt to motivate present-day advantage on the basis of disadvantage to someone else in history. This is an example of the moral corruption implicit in the identity group mindset, in this case even extending the identity group to those long dead. Secondly, the feminist presentation of history as consisting predominantly of millennia of men oppressing women is a wild distortion. The gendered society imposed upon men and women different roles, different responsibilities, and different expectations. By ignoring the advantages to one sex and the disadvantages to the other, a story of oppression can be spun out of straw. Let me put this thought in your minds. If a far better soundbite version of history is the few oppressing the many, and both the few and the many were of both sexes, then who exactly is it that stands to benefit by obscuring that fact with an alternative view of the past? The answer is surely the few, the ruling or influential classes. And if the feminist version of history is doing the obscuring, with whom can you conclude that the feminist axis is truly aligned? Feminism is a system of power. It vies with or allies with other systems of power, as they all do. Don't confuse it with being nice to women or anyone else. Universal suffrage provides an illustration of how the popular perception of history is distorted. But for sake of variety, let me turn instead to that other favourite of the feminists, the law of coverture. Or, to be more precise, the social conditions which truly prevailed at the time that coverture was in place. It's worth emphasising that at the time in question, 95% of people were working class and had little money to speak of. They existed from hand to mouth. If they were lucky and they were in work, they had enough money to pay the rent and keep themselves fed until the next payday and nothing more. Since coverture mostly concerns financial matters, coverture would have been an irrelevance to the majority of people. It's worth bearing that in mind, since it's rarely made clear in feminist accounts that it is predominantly the moneyed classes that were affected. Yet another reminder of the middle class concerns of feminism. Until around the mid-Victorian period, English common law had held that a married couple constituted a single legal entity. Under the system of coverture, the husband was the manifestation of that legal entity, whilst the wife's legal status became covert, i.e. hidden. Whilst an unmarried woman could own property and enter into legal contracts in her own right, this was, ostensibly, denied to a married woman under coverture, because she was held to be legally tied to her husband, who must act for them as a couple in legal matters. Now, I'm no apologist for the system of coverture, but some feminists are rather coy about the flip side of the arrangement. Pause to consider for a moment the great boon that being legally non-existent might be to the unscrupulous or the criminal. Since the man was the manifest legal entity, he became responsible for crimes or torts committed by his wife. The most common example of this were the Victorian debtors' prisons. Some 10,000 people, 98% of them men, were imprisoned yearly for debt in the Victorian era. But it's reasonable to suppose that women were responsible for incurring at least half of the debts. Even if the debts were incurred by the wife, it was the husband who went to prison. It doesn't sound very much like male privilege to me. But it is in respect of a wife's financial independence or lack thereof that coverture is usually discussed. Under coverture, the husband was obliged to provide financially for his wife. But the principle of necessaries under coverture meant that the wife could herself enter a contract for goods or purchase any goods on credit if they were deemed to fall under the aegis of necessaries. This could be done unilaterally without the husband's knowledge, though he would still be responsible for honouring the debt. This was, of course, a practical necessity, because wives were usually charged with maintaining the household and hence with spending the bulk of the domestic monies. What constituted necessaries was highly class and social status dependent. Thus, for a woman of high social status, such items as a carriage, expensive lace clothing, and the hire of servants would be deemed necessaries because they were expected of a woman in her position. The law of necessaries effectively gave wives great powers of consumption without legal responsibility for the consequences. This is oppression, is it? The beneficial aspects of coverture for wives did not apply only whilst the marriage lasted. The law of necessaries extended even to separated wives, and in some cases also to common law wives. An estranged wife could continue to run up debts with which to burden her husband. This was commonly used as a tactic to force the husband to agree to divorce terms favourable to the wife. Such estranged wives could, and did, push the strategy so far as having the husband imprisoned by running up unmanageable debts until he gave them what they wanted. So, is the feminist portrayal of coverture as patriarchal oppression of women the complete and undistorted picture of historical reality? Clearly not. The law of coverture effectively placed a legal obligation upon husbands to ensure their wives obeyed the law. A particularly egregious example of this is the Skimmington Ride. It's still the case today that society has a hard time accepting that some men may be the victim of partner abuse rather than the perpetrator. In historical times, things were no better. A man who allowed himself to be abused by his wife would be punished for it by his community. A husband was expected to control his wife. If she beat him, then this was regarded as a failing on his part. The punishment was the Skimington Ride, in which the man was obliged to ride a donkey through the town facing backwards and thus looking ridiculous, whilst the populace would bang pots and pans and jeer and mock him by calling out insults. The modern equivalent, I suppose, is the male victim of partner violence who phones the police only to find that he is the one they arrest. And that brings me to the second of my themes, the role of needs in bending the Equality Act to feminists' will. Women need protection and men do not. It's as simple as that. This is the ancient bias in human social psychology, which is the true driver behind VAUG, policies under violence against women and girls. Time is too short to lay out for you the relevance of VAUG in the family courts, and hence upon fathers' access to their own children. Please take that as understood. Sorry, Mike. VAUG 2 is given a spurious legitimacy by appeal to a mythical version of history. The Istanbul Convention, which the UK has signed and is committed to ratifying as soon as possible, rationalises an explicitly sexist policy by, I quote, recognising that violence against women is a manifestation of historically unequal power relations between women and men, which have led to domination over and discrimination against women by men. The same words are repeated in the Council of Europe's current gender equality strategy. Consider also the draft European Framework National Statute for the Promotion of Tolerance. Should this proposed national statute ever take off, one of its stated aims is to eliminate anti-feminism. Thankfully, it's currently going nowhere under the leadership of Tony Blair. It states, the special protection afforded to members of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups may imply a preferential treatment. Strictly speaking, this preferential treatment goes beyond mere respect and acceptance lying at the root of tolerance. Still, the present provision is justified by the linkage between historical intolerance and vulnerability. You see why I so often focus on history. A mythological history is one of the foundations of the feminist mindset. But so too is female vulnerability, and hence neediness, a useful justification for preferential treatment, as explicitly sanctioned by the Equalities Act. And what nasty swine is going to build a political platform on a policy of denying women protection? You see how moral blackmail coerces politicians of all persuasions to get on board with the VAUG agenda. Meanwhile, true equality, for those of us who remember what that means, is left for dead. 2019 has been another significant year in the progress of VAUG. In January, the government reported on the consultation exercise on its proposed domestic abuse bill. And in June, the Bill's Committee published their report. The following month, the government published their response to the committee and also published a revised draft bill. This was then subject to a second reading in the House of Commons in October. There are a number of radical changes proposed by the bill, but the recommendations of the committee were far more radical still. Let me try to pull out some of the salient features. The committee wanted a gendered definition of domestic abuse. The government so far has resisted this. But apparently, in an attempt to appease the feminist lobby, the government undertook to, I quote, recognise the gendered nature of abuse through statutory guidance, and hence have included guidance to that effect in the revised bill. But conceding the gendered nature of domestic abuse perpetuates the myth that domestic abuse is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men upon women, that women perceive the harm of such abuse far more acutely than do men, and that domestic abuse is specifically a tool used by men to maintain patriarchal power and control over women. All these claims are refuted by empirical evidence. But you see how this is an appeal to the needs of women being so much greater than the needs of men, thus justifying an overtly sexist position via the Equality Act's provision in relation to needs. You see how this trick is performed. You see how prejudice is repackaged as the new equality. As an indication of the misinformation swilling around Parliament when these matters are debated, this is what the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Crime, Safeguarding and Vulnerability, Victoria Atkins, said during a debate on the bill on the 16th of July. Of the 2 million victims, we estimate that around 1.3 million are female and around 695,000 are male. And within that 695,000, that's the male victims, we believe, and it's very difficult to identify this, and there are problems in doing so, that the majority of perpetrators are male. This statement is false. It has been known to be false for decades. It is doubly false, in fact, because it is neither difficult nor problematic to confirm that it is false. The Minister has been notified of this fact. The bill proposes to make national government funding of refuge charities a statutory obligation. This is where the gendered perception of domestic abuse has bite. It results in funding being channeled disproportionately to women's charities, thus perpetuating the prevailing gross imbalance in service provision by sex. Mankind Initiative made a strong appeal in their consultation submission that parental alienation be recognised within the bill as a form of domestic abuse. But neither the draft bill nor the committee report make any mention of recognising this form of serious abuse. In the family courts, many fathers are obliged to represent themselves as litigants in person. In half of child contact cases, yes, half of cases, these men face domestic abuse allegations. This has led to men having to question their accuser themselves on some occasions. The bill will prohibit this practice. To be precise, the prohibition will apply if the accused has been charged with, convicted of, or accepted a caution for domestic abuse, or if there is a protection order against him. But even if these requirements are not met, there is provision in the bill giving the court discretion to prohibit cross-examination by litigants in person in cases, I quote, where they consider that the victim would suffer significant distress or the quality of their evidence would be diminished. Now the victim by which of course they mean the alleged victim, is most likely to be distressed if she is in fact lying, seems to escape them. The government has stated in their response to the committee that our expectation is that this discretion, that is the discretion to prohibit cross-examination anyway, will be widely used, and that every victim, i.e. alleged victim, of domestic abuse, however evidenced, should benefit from the provision. The bill would create a new domestic abuse commissioner. Well, it already has, despite the fact the bill is still a bill and not yet an act. The commissioner designate has already been appointed, Nicole Jacobs. Working 2 or 3 days per week, she will earn up to £140,000 a year. Nice work if you can get it. The proposed powers of this commissioner are breathtaking. I quote, "The commissioner may do anything which the commissioner considers will facilitate or is incidental or conducive to the carrying out of the commissioner's functions. And the commissioner may request a specific public authority to cooperate with the commissioner in any way that the commissioner considers necessary for the purposes of the commissioner's functions." Under pressure from the committee, the draft bill was amended to include what I think I can call supra-governmental powers. The Commissioner's strategic plan need not now be approved by the Secretary of State. Moreover, not only local authorities, but also any and all government departments, and that means ministers, will be obligated to confirm the action they have taken to address the Commissioner's recommendations or to explain why action has failed to be taken. Direct accountability to Parliament will provide the Commissioner with a degree of independence from government, as well as being able to exercise leverage over ministers. The Vorg lobby, long since disproportionately powerful, is now to attain influence not within, but over government departments. The bill will further strengthen existing powers to constrain, restrain, and criminalise those accused of domestic abuse. The escalating sequence of protection notices, protection orders and non-molestation orders can see a man ejected from his home with immediate effect and kept out of it without limit. The new bill will make breaching the terms of a protection notice or protection order a criminal offence. These arrangements mean that a man may be formally branded a criminal with a criminal record and locked up without ever facing trial or any other meaningful test of the accusations against him. Raising a domestic abuse protection notice requires only the opinion of a police officer. The terms will invariably prohibit any form of contact with the alleged victim. A common scenario is this. The alleged victim phones the alleged perpetrator. He picks up. He has now breached the terms of his domestic abuse protection notice and is liable to immediate arrest without further investigation or warrant. When the magistrate subsequently considers the application for a domestic abuse protection order, the police officer reports that the man has already breached the terms of his protection notice, and the magistrate is then strongly inclined to grant the protection order. This is how the system works. The end result is frequently that the man in question, whose alleged offence is typically never meaningfully investigated in any way, is estranged from his children, possibly forever. This is, lamentably, by no means the only reason to be concerned that long-cherished principles of justice are now being overturned. But that's another story, and I'm out of time. Thank you.